Hi, I'm Carrie Penny, and on this episode of Secret Heart Broadcasting, I cannot believe that Lorna Crozier she's going to be on the show. Lorna is a Governor General's award-winning poet. I mean, she's won so many awards. She's a poet, a prose writer, author of 2 memoirs. She has written about life on the prairies, life on the West Coast, poems of grief over the loss of her late husband, the poet Patrick Lane, poems of hope with her new love, funny poems. She is a teacher, a wise woman, a generous spirit, someone who, when you listen to them, you just think, oh, I'm going to make myself a better person. Anyway, Lorna Crozier, my literary hero on this episode of Secret Heart Broadcasting. Hi, I'm Carrie Penny, and on this episode of Secret Heart Broadcasting, I am so excited to be talking with Lorna Crozier. Right up front, I'm going to say Lorna is one of my all-time favorite authors ever in the world. Her first memoir, this beautiful book, and I'm going to be holding up a lot of books, Small Beneath the Sky, is gorgeous. I have 2 copies. It's breathtaking. Amazon says that is one of the 100 books you should read in your life before you die, so please read it. It was also one of my mom's favorite books. Lorna has written, I think, 18 books of poetry to date. We can talk about if that's true or not true. She is an officer of the Order of Canada. She holds 5 honorary doctorates. Her books have received many awards, including the Governor General's Award for Poetry. Her second memoir, which I also have here, Through the Garden with Cats, a love story, speaks of the time of the decline of her husband, the poet Patrick Lane, and also looks back on their life together. And, kind of talks about the echoes of the natural world too, and was followed by this book of poetry, which I reread again last night after that. After that was written after Patrick's death, and Lorna documents, oh my goodness, love and grief and life, and the poems are gorgeous. And I think there's some baked in magic into those words. And I was reading this last night, and I said before we started recording, coyotes were howling in the distance as I was reading a poem. It's so dramatic and fantastic. Oh, I could go on, and I will. And honestly, I've been looking so forward to this conversation with Lorna, a wise and generous teacher, a formidable gardener. Lorna, welcome to Secret Heart Broadcasting.
It's wonderful to see you again. It's been a while.
In Small Beneath the Sky, it was the first time you really were exploring certainly autobiography and prose, and it documents your growing up in Saskatchewan, your humble beginnings, your humble roots. It was also one of my mom's favorite books, and I have her copy too, her signed copy, signed by you.
I remember very vividly this beautiful young woman and this beautiful older woman coming up after I had read from this book at the Calgary Writers Festival and asking me to sign it. And your mom had such vividness and loveliness to her character. I could sense that right away. And we sat down and talked for a while, right? I just didn't sign the book. The 3 of us had a lovely conversation. And it was, you sign books for people, and you don't always remember the people you sign for. But I do remember the 2 of you very vividly.
Oh, well, that's lovely. And my mother, I'm sure, is smiling from wherever she is too. It was my mom who introduced me to your poetry. Maybe we should, this book, let's bounce around. Inventing the Hawk was the book that my mom gave to me. And honestly, Lorna, at the time I was like, oh, insufferable, and thought, well, any book you like, I'm probably not going to like, but thanks, Mom. And of course, then I did like it, but I was not gracious when she gifted me this book. And look, here's her little face in this book.
Oh, lovely.
This won the Governor General's Award, right?
Yeah, that was the one.
And that was pretty early in your career, right?
Yeah, I think I was in my early 40s. So, many people win it younger, and many people have to wait till they're 85, and most people don't get the award. So it was an okay time to get it. It was, that little stamp of affirmation. I really object to the idea of awards. There's one winner and everyone else feels like a loser. But when you do receive a national award, it does give you a bit of a boost. So I'd be hypocritical if I didn't say that I I didn't enjoy, getting the awards that I have.
So you both shared, you and my mother, growing up on the Saskatchewan prairies, sort of childhood, certainly at different times. I developed a kind of romance about the Saskatchewan prairies, hearing my mom's stories. I would say her landscape definitely was an important part of her life. And I'm wondering about you and that landscape. Tell me a bit about growing up. Like, what was that like? I'm sure you didn't think, or your parents or your town didn't think, there's going to be the Governor General's award-winning poet, Lorna Crozier, in grade 2.
Well, I really do think that where we were born and where we spent the early years of our childhood shapes who we are. I think the landscape, the light, the wind, the dust, everything gets into our blood and bones. And I've been away from the prairie since 1991 when I took up the offer of a job on Vancouver Island at the University of Victoria. But I still, in my mind, when I'm writing, have that southwest short grassland prairie of Saskatchewan, that corner of Saskatchewan, in my imagery, in my mind. I think my rhythms come from there. It's hard to define where one's body rhythms are, but definitely when I'm writing on the prairies, I used to go back to a writer's retreat every summer at a Benedictine monastery near Saskatoon, and I would often write my first drafts walking down the grid road, past the ripening wheat fields, and the sound of my runners on the gravel, the sounds I was hearing in the air, my body movement definitely made its way into the poems. So I'm very much a person who believes that landscape shapes us. And if I had been born on the and Vancouver Island in the rainforest where I live now, I think I would have been a different person, a different human being. And not only because my stories would have been different, because my parents would have done different things, but I think growing up among trees would have made my mental processes different than they are now. Hearing water all the time, standing at the edge of the ocean instead of standing at the edge of the field would have made both me and my writing different.
Even as you're speaking, I'm feeling the rhythm of that prairie. You speak like a poet. It was beautiful. I think I was actually kind of, moving to that rhythm of your words there. Can you talk about, your parents growing up, and were they, I don't think either of your parents went to university, right? Like you were. So were they encouraging of, certainly I'm picturing you as a very curious child, maybe coming to the edge of town, or I don't know, maybe fill me in on what was that like, and were they encouraging of who you were?
Not at all. Not in a mean way. I mean, they did what they were capable of. Their lives were extremely limited. My mom's childhood could have been out of Dickens. She lived on a dry land farm near Swift Current, where I grew up, near a little town called Success, which failed during the dirty 30s. And she was one of 7 children, middle child. And for some reason, her parents sold her to a farm down the road when she was 4 years old. And by sold, I mean she went there to live. And I believe that the farmers paid my grandparents money for my mom to be their little slave child. She learned to make bread when she was 4. And Mrs. Watson got her a stool so she could pound the bread down on the corner. Mrs. Watson was afraid of storms, so Mom would turn the handle of a phonograph whenever there was a storm. And so she hated storms herself when she grew up. And she wasn't allowed to go home for Christmas. And the family gave the daughters their Christmas presents, and Mom was given nothing. She was held back from school for a year. So that was her childhood. And she got her grade 12 and might have gone on to do something else, except the dirty 30s, struck the prairies. And there was absolutely no money, no feed for the horses. People lined up at the train station to get salt cod from Newfoundland and apples from Ontario. So her life was limited in terms of choices. And my dad, who was the older of two sons, grew up on a farm across the road from my mother's. They got married when they were both around 20. And his mother, for some unknown reason, left the farm to his younger brother and nothing to him, although he was a good farmer and wanted to be a farmer. So they moved into the small city of Swift Current from there, and that's where I was born. And my dad picked up, hard manual labor for many years. My mom sold tickets at the swimming pool and at the hockey games, cleaned houses, and that's how they made their income. So they were very proud of my brother, 7 years older than me, and me. They were proud that we were smart in school, but they didn't have high hopes for us because high hopes weren't part of what they knew. So even when I decided I wanted to go to university, my mom said, "Why would you do that? You'll just get married anyway." And I'm glad I had the gumption to not just follow that bad prediction of my future, and that I insisted that I go. And I think part of her negativity was that she was hurt and embarrassed that they couldn't support me in any way. And so she wanted to nip hope in the bud before it could blossom into something I couldn't handle.
So almost to protect you.
Yeah, I think so. And in those days, there was a provincial grant if your grades were good enough. And I worked in the summer and I got one of those grants, and I was able to pay my own way through university, through summer jobs. I got married in my second year. So she was partly right, but I got married with 2 years of university under my belt. But, they didn't understand my ambitions and where I wanted to go with them. And certainly not ambitions for a post-secondary education. And to think of me as a writer was right outside of their ken. It was outside of mine too, because, like most people of my generation, I thought writers were English male and dead. So how could I, coming from where I came from, not only my family, but small city Saskatchewan, how could I ever be a writer?
Your mom later on in her life, though, was a big supporter of yours, right? Like she sort of maybe didn't understand what it was you did, but there was is it fair to say you rekindled a hope in her with your success?
Oh boy, that's a nice way of putting it. Yeah, all my books were on her coffee table. And there were quite a few, even by the time she died. There must have been around 12. So all 12 poetry books were laid out for anyone who came to visit could see. And my brother had been an Air Force helicopter rescue pilot. And Reader's Digest had a story about him rescuing a number of sailors from a Dutch freighter with waves 70 feet high. So she had that out there as well. So she thought her two kids had done really well. But I embarrassed her at quite a few times, and I feel a little sorry for that. Many of my poems were feminist and sexual and talked about the body, and she would have preferred that I not do that. And when I was interviewed on CBC National Radio, by Peter Zosky several times, there were things I said that she wished that I hadn't. For one thing, I said that Patrick and I were living together and not married. And she said, "Why do you have to tell everybody that? Like, you have to do what you have to do, but I don't know why you have to tell everybody." So she was supportive and proud, but in some ways, she might have preferred that I was a more conventional person and not so public about my life.
Well, thank goodness you are. Thank goodness you're like a geyser, I think, with that kind of courage. You spoke about going to university and marrying in your second year. You weren't, you didn't sign up for the writing program. I think you were originally a teacher, right? Or planning on being a teacher.
Yeah, what I did was take English literature classes and psychology because I didn't know what I wanted to do or what I wanted to be. And so that's kind of the thing you would take if you were more literary than scientific. And I definitely wasn't scientific. So I got a BA, and then I had to work. I had to make money. And so 1 year of education allowed you to teach high school. And so that's what I did. I kind of tumbled into education. And I found out that I really enjoyed teaching. I really enjoyed working with students. And I worked my butt off. My first job was in a country school, grade 7 to 11, literature and composition. And to prepare for those classes and then do all the grading, I just worked my butt off. But like I said, I felt that maybe there had been a calling that I hadn't even heard. The calling was faint, or I was too deaf to hear it. But I think teaching has been, in a way, a calling for me. When I was 16, I was a lifeguard at the Swift swimming pool, and I taught swimming lessons. And I remember one of the mothers standing outside of the fence. She happened to be a French teacher in the high school, and she called me over and said, "Lorna, you have a skill. You have a teaching skill, and maybe you should consider doing that." I didn't till many years later, but I remembered her prophetic words after I started teaching.
So you would have at that time had, kind of the ideal life, right? You had a full-time job and you were teaching, you were married, you had, all the traditional boxes were ticked, but that must not have felt right.
Yeah, my poor mom again. I went back and taught in the town where I grew up, which was not really a matter of choice. My first husband and I were going to be let go from the small school we were teaching in because we were too radical. And we both had jobs. And so the only place that would hire the two of us at the time was the high school in my hometown. So we went back there, and I just felt more and more constricted. I knew there was something in me that wasn't being listened to, that wasn't being satisfied. I knew I had to feed this thing, even though I couldn't see what it was. And I was writing, showing my work to one or two friends, writing, not that well. And then I stumbled into the Summer School of the Arts in Fort Capel, Saskatchewan. And I went there in my mid-20s, and my world just opened up, like clouds suddenly being blown away by the wind. And the shining sun for me was discovering like-minded people who were as obsessive about reading as I was, who were as obsessive about trying to learn how to write, who encouraged me and said I had something that, that maybe poetry indeed was something that I could be good at. And then everything shifted. And I knew I didn't want to remain a high school teacher. I knew, even though my husband was a really wonderful man, that I wasn't for him, that I needed to kick my world apart. I wanted to be an artist and hang around with artists and do outlandish things. And so I did. I left after 10 years of marriage and 7 years of teaching high school, and went on the road with Patrick, not knowing where the road was going to end, whether we were just going to be together for a summer or we ended up being together for 40 years.
So you fell in love with poetry at the Fort Capel kind of summer school, and then you fell in love was Patrick there?
No.
And we're speaking of Patrick Lane.
Yeah. At the summer school, though, this lovely fellow poet named Robert Curry, who taught high school in Moose Jaw and had published a few books by then, gave me a book by Patrick Lane. I think it was Beware the Months of Fire. And he said, "Lorna, I think you'll love this poet." And he meant poetry, right? And I did. I fell in love instantly with Patrick's voice, with the toughness of his imagery, his bravery, his identification with the poor and the weak, his imagery that came from the natural world. And then I met him. He was brought in to give a workshop, and I drove from Swift to Regina to take it. And I thought he was an old fat guy because his photograph on the back of that book wasn't very complimentary. And here was this guy who was, 9 years older than me, but he'd been building houses all summer. and he had these wonderful carpenter's hands and had a cowboy shirt on with snap buttons and blue jeans. And right away I thought, whoa, boy, not only is his poetry full of vibrancy and energy and grace, but the man is as well. So we both had that kind of zing, that famous zing. But 2 years went by before we saw each other again. He was married, 2 little children, lived on the Sunshine Coast in a place called Half Moon Bay. He went back, and then at a Saskatchewan Writers Guild conference, I looked at the program, and on the program was Patrick's name. And although we hadn't communicated for those 2 years, I knew I was in trouble. It was something, I always went to those conferences. I wouldn't have not gone, but I knew I was going to see him, and I knew my life was going to shift. And it did. We met. There were, not only sparks, but firecrackers went off. He went home, tried to do the best he could for his wife and his kids. I went home, and then we ended up going off together. He drove to the Summer School of the Arts, where I was by then teaching, and we hit the road. And the road turned out to be a long one.
Having 2 artists, and you're both are you both Aries? Am I crazy in imagining that?
No, I'm Gemini, but Gemini and Aries get along really well. I'm the air that feeds the fire.
Okay, so how is that in relationship with 2 artists with very strong voices, very different voices? And you already said the beginning of this was like kapow. How did that play out in terms of a long-term relationship? Because I would think, oh, that initial kapow is not sustainable.
Yeah, there aren't many writers that live together. I think we could list them on probably 2 hands, and often it's they're writing in different genres. But we really got each other. We really understood each other almost instantaneously. And I don't know that we even articulated this, but we knew that we were living a life as writers, that writing was never going to come second in our lives or our relationship. No matter what we did, we would find a way to give the other person space to write. And we would be there to encourage when things weren't going well, to inspire, to edit. We edited each other's work. And I think it would have been more difficult had we been peers, had we started at the same time. But the year we got together in 1978, he won the Governor General's Award. And I was just thrilled for him. And he'd had a few books out. I'd had one small book. So I was very much at the beginning. And if we had been at the same age, at the same level, there might have been competition. But I don't think we ever felt competitive with one another. We just felt thrilled when the other one would get an honor. And, we took turns earning money. He would be a writer in residence one year. I'd be another year. One of us would get a grant. One of us wouldn't, and then the other one would. So for 15 years, we lived by our wits, moving from city to city, doing things like residency. So it was a wild, crazy, fun, poetic time. But also eventually became shadowed by his alcoholism.
I grew up the child of an alcoholic, so I am finely tuned and have in the past attracted that kind of, vibe. What's the word? Like a frequency. There's a kind of knowing, not knowing, and then there's the knowing. And I'm wondering if you had that experience, and then what on earth do you do? Because, you love this man.
Yeah. And I grew up with an alcoholic father. So, I was very familiar with, I guess, how not to live with an alcoholic. I think my mom's life would have been so much better had she learned that she couldn't control my father's drinking and found a way to be happy in herself in the relationship. With Patrick, the literary world then was kind of a crazy world in a wonderful way. The League of Canadian Poets meetings, everybody drank and danced and flirted. every time we'd get together with our poetry friends, it was one long, late night of, let me read you Lorca's poem. Let me read you Browning. Let me read you Plath. And meanwhile, the beer and the wine and the whiskey are flowing. And we both had a wonderful time. But then the wonderful time started to thin. And booze for Patrick became not a pleasure, but a necessity. And then it wasn't so much fun. It was hard for me because I began by thinking, if he loved me, he'd quit drinking. But of course, it's got nothing to do with love. Any addiction is this crazy beast inside you that demands to be fed no matter what you'd like to do or who you'd like to be or who you love. And so what saved me really was going to Al-Anon, which is a group for people who live with alcoholics or have a friend who's an alcoholic or a parent who was an alcoholic. And it really helped me more than I can say. Patrick was 20 years sober, almost 20 years sober, and I still went to Al-Anon once a week. And even though he's been 7 years gone, I go to Al-Anon once a week because I find what I learned there to be parts of learning how to have a good life, parts of, how can I be an honest, authentic person, not control other people, take responsibility for myself. How can I make a distinction between caring too much for others and self-care? How can I learn to say no with grace when I don't want to do something? All of those things are some of the learning that comes out of that program.
Wow, that's interesting because I went as a young teen and it didn't fit for me, but I was also in a very brittle, know-it-all place of my life. So I love hearing that. So can you talk about writing during, I kind of have two questions. Like, has your writing practice changed then from the beginning to now? And you've had, when we think about, well, you've just talked about Patrick's drinking and the chaos that, that must have brought up in your life. Did your writing practice change? And how do you, I guess maybe the bigger question is, what is writing for you? Like, that's coming up no matter what, right? You are connected in writing.
Yeah, I don't know who I would be or how I would spend my time if I were not writing or thinking about writing or reading great literature, hoping it will help me be a better writer. I don't write every day, but I certainly read every day. And everything that has visited me, whether it be a joyous thing or a painful thing, I'm just built, or else I trained myself, I don't know what it is, to have to find words to express what is going on. And I do that without censors, without a little creature on my shoulder saying, well, you can't say that, or you're going to be hurting someone if you say that. I think I let those censors speak to me when I decide whether what I've just written should be public or not, whether I should send it out to be published. But when I'm writing, I'm just trying to get close to something that I really can't even articulate. But there's Earl Burney said that writing a poem is like having an interior itch that you have to scratch. And I think that comes as close as anything to saying what it feels like for me to try to get those words on the page and then say later, oh, that's what I'm thinking about. That's what I'm feeling. That's the analogy that helps me understand what's happening. And more, like my place in the world, the big questions, what am I doing here? Am I living my life the way I should be? Is there any meaning to my days? What's going to happen after? I mean, all those things I think one touches upon when you're writing, especially when you're writing poetry. I can't imagine myself not writing.
So you're not saying, oh, I want to write a poem about grief. You're just saying, I am writing.
That's a really good way of putting it. Yeah, I'm just writing because I am so wrecked and so sad. And how am I going to articulate this place I'm in right now? And I don't think of writing in terms of a reader in the beginning. I just think of writing to my best self, to my funnier self, to my smarter self, to my more philosophical self. I'm writing towards the best part of me. I think it might be why sometimes we're disappointed when we meet writers in person, because their best selves are in the words on the page. And then we meet this guy who turns out to be a total jerk. And although we love the women in his novels, we can see that he mistreats his wife. It can be quite a disappointment, because I think they're very ordinary people, but they become something better than themselves when they get the writing right. If they're good writers.
I love that idea of writing to my best self. And even holding the idea of a best self, right? Which is an act of rebellion and hope. Especially, I don't know, I feel like the more I think about that, the more important it is to hold that and strive for that. What is my best self? How am I my best self?
Yeah, I don't know a writer who thinks they're smart, I mean, they hope they're writing smart, but I don't know any writer who says, gee, am I a very smart, well-read person? If I did, I don't think I'd want to hang around with them. I think many writers I know are very damaged people who don't feel great about themselves because of where they came from, because they know of the things they've done and they wish they could have done better. They probably don't think they're great moms or dads or, spouses. So I think the stumbly, bumbly people are just trying the best way they can to find moments of grace and knowledge in their writing. And for me, that whatever I know that comes out of my poems just comes into me in the act of writing. I don't think before I write, oh, I'm going to write something about, the philosophy of the maple tree. It might come out, but it's never pre-planned. It's almost like a given. Something mysterious enters the room and the tips of my fingers.
Do you write on your computer or do you write by hand?
I used to write more by hand. Mainly I write on my computer now. When I'm at the writer's retreat at the Abbey I was mentioning, and I come in all sweaty and dusty from my long grid walk, I'll often just quickly scratch something on a piece of paper, and then I go have a shower and a cup of coffee, and then I go to my computer. But if I were working on a new poem this morning, I go directly to the computer. Then I print and I print and I print, and I use a pen and scratch out lines and use a pen and write in better words and all that stuff. I need paper in front of me to work on revisions.
So how do you know when it's done?
Yeah, that's such a tough question. I think it was Paul Valray who said poems are never finished, they're just abandoned. And I kind of agree with him. My new manuscript, which is coming out next year, has been in the hands of McClellan and Stewart for 3 years now. It will have been 3 years by the time it comes out. And I sent them the manuscript thinking it was as good as it was going to be. And I've been tinkering with that. Almost every week I go back in and I make another change because they don't have to have the final copy until Christmas. So I can't leave it alone. I have to, at Christmas I'll say that's it. But that's the only time I would stop revising is when I have to.
After that, is that your 18th book of poetry to date?
I think it's more than that. I think it might be 20.
I want to just pause in that grieving piece. It would have been totally fine. And the entire world and your community, your family would have understood that after Patrick's death, if you were like, I need a minute. And that minute could have been like a year or 2 years or, and now you could have completely pivoted and you didn't, I don't think. Did you pause and tell me a bit about that transition?
I didn't, but I'd been working on the second memoir you mentioned, Through the Garden, A Love Story with Cats, when Patrick was still around, but very, very ill. And again, I thought, how am I going to get through seeing this strong man grow weaker every day? This man who built fences and pruned trees and moved rocks in the garden. who can hardly get out of bed in the morning. And I used to dread coming home if I went out for something because I was afraid he'd still be in bed and not up and about. And often he was just supine in the bedroom. And I thought, well, the only way I'm going to be able to survive this is to do what I always do and to write about it, to write about our lives together in the garden. And so I started it. I started it when he was in the middle of his sickness. And I ended it just after he died. I still had a last chapter or so to do, but I ended it fictionally with him still being alive. And I contacted an agent. He sold it very, very quickly to McClelland and Stewart. It came out. And then I had a folder of Patrick's poems that he'd left behind that he had asked me to look at. So I knew I had to get those out if I thought they were good enough to honor him. And I did. I thought they were wonderful. So I went to work on those. And then I still hadn't poetically dug down. Yeah, that beautiful book, The Quiet in Me. I just love it. I love the cover and everything about it. I felt so good getting that out for him. And then I had my own words and poetry to dig for and to bring out into the light. So I started after that, at that point. And, it's funny when I look back at my grieving time, and of course I'm still grieving, but when I look back at it, I say to people, oh, those first 2 years I was completely numb. And then I go, oh, wait a minute. How could I have been completely numb and done all of that? But I still think I was numb, but I was writing. It's a strange kind of thing. Did I have a clone, who came into my office? I see myself in bed a lot with the cat. I see myself drinking too much every night so I could stagger off to bed alone and fall asleep. I don't see myself writing or working on those 3 books, and yet somehow I did.
This book, I mentioned I read it last night with the coyotes howling at that gorgeous poem. There's so many gorgeous poems. There's a poem in here near the end, and my image of it is you're sitting near water, and all of a sudden you realize your body's alive, and you're having like these feeling, like it's a sexual feeling in the poem, like I'm still alive, and yeah, I think that is so important because there's that when you lose someone you love, and I've never lost, a beloved partner. You have. There's that. You almost forget that you didn't die. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does. And of course, part of you wishes that you had gone with him. And many people say, I wish it had been me and not him or her. It's a common feeling. Why am I left here alone? And who am I? Who am I going to be after having been this person for 40 years with this extraordinary man who was not only my partner, but my muse in some ways, my main editor, my main supporter, my biggest fan as I was his. How am I going to get by now in this aging, lonely little body? How am I going to learn to walk in the world again?
Well, how do you? How did you? How are you?
Well, I guess writing did it. One of my friends reminded me the other day that the first year, which was 2019, I was on the road all the time because I had, the memoir out. I was traveling. I was giving workshops. I didn't say no to anything. And my dear friends, I realize now, really bent over backwards coming and staying in the house and taking care of our semi-wild cat and doing, some work in the garden. They were extremely generous. I guess they knew that I had to explode my energy outward during that time. And then you're quite right. That poem in the book where I'm sitting looking at the water, the persona is sitting looking at the water and feeling her body again, was a revelation. When I look back at the book, I saw, there's some shift going on here. there's some change. Already, the person who wrote this book, the speaker, the first person, singular in this book, is on her way to becoming something else. And that was a surprise to me, that the poem predicted the near future, something that was going to happen next.
I think I'm interested in this idea of a poem predicting something and then calling to you. Like you were able to find a place in yourself to make room for another person in your life. Like grief didn't kill you.
No, it didn't. And I think it's a good story because I think it's a story of hope. I thought at age 70 that was it for me in terms of falling in love, living with someone, having sex, all of that stuff was over. I was going to be more of a ascete, a hermit, doing writing, doing readings, doing those things, but living in a solitary way. And then when Through the Garden came out, I was interviewed by Sheila Rogers on the next chapter. And I heard after the interview, I heard from quite a few people. It was quite lovely by email. I'm not on Facebook or any of those other things, just on email. And I got an email from a lovely man whom I had met 10 years before in Sault Ste. Marie from Algoma University, because I'd been invited to visit there for a week as a resident poet. And I had a wonderful time there, loved the faculty. They took me out walking in the forest in the snow and had potlucks for me. And so I hung around with the faculty, including him, for, a decent amount of time. And my host asked me if I wanted to see their resident artist studio. And so I went to Tom O'Flanagan's studio in an old airport hangar. And I really loved his work. So he's the one who wrote to me when he heard me on the radio. He said that he'd heard my voice break. And when I met him, he was very happily married. I was very happily with Patrick. And he said, I don't know if you knew, but my wife died 5 years ago. And I heard the break in your voice. And I just wanted to let you know that if you want to talk to someone, I have some idea what you're going through. And he said, of course, at the beginning, you probably won't remember me, da-da-da-da-da. And I wrote back to everybody who wrote me over that book and that interview. And I wrote back to him and said, of course, I remember you and I remember your studio. And I would have purchased one of your 7-foot tall monks had I had a way to bring it home or had I known Patrick would like it. He wrote back, said, I still have a couple of those monks. I'd be pleased to give you one. Then we started talking about how he was going to get the monk out to me. And then finally, I did phone him and we talked for 3 hours. And Friday night phone calls became our way of dating, even though we didn't know we were dating. And so he is here with me now in the house Patrick and I lived in the garden. We built a studio in the back for him. And I'm living with another artistic individual, with a painter, which is fascinating because I'm learning so much about visual art that I didn't know before. Because he's taught for almost 40 years, he's full of all of this rich, delicious information about Monet and Rembrandt and Picasso and Braque and Helen Frankenthaler. And it's, I see the parallels with writing. So we'll talk about how he suddenly found the right blue for this one painting. And I'll say, oh, that's just like suddenly the right image comes out of nowhere. So it's kind of a parallel artistic life going on. And we bring each other's dead partners into our spaces, into our conversation, into the way we are with each other. He has a small recipe book in his wife's handwriting that I still see him using and look at. Every stone, every tree in this garden has been touched by Patrick's hands. He now walks in the garden amongst those stones and trees and sits there, and Patrick's presence does not go away. So it's a way, it's a new life, but it's bringing in the old life. It's a new love, but the old loves are sitting there beside us.
I love that. Yeah, it's so honoring. It's so, I don't know. The word that came to my mind was holy.
Yeah.
So has your writing changed as a result, or or living in the house with someone, has your process changed? Has there been any change in how you are creatively bringing yourself to the world?
Not that I'm aware of. He's in his studio for hours every day, and I go into my office, my messy room, almost every day, and we work independently. But Patrick and I did that as well. This new book that is coming out with McClellan and Stewart is really a continuation of a book I wrote about 8 years ago called The Book of Marvels, which was a book about objects. And I loved the prose poem form, and I loved the idea of looking at things so carefully and in a bit of a wonky way so much that I've rewritten another whole book like that. So I don't know that the writing has changed. It's just continued. It just keeps going on. And then I've written a new series of poems about this new relationship as well that I'm not ready to release yet. They have to sit and simmer for a while longer.
One thing we didn't talk about, we talked a lot about grief and heaviness. You're really funny. Like Book of Marvels makes me laugh out loud. And I think that was also a Globe and Mail top 100. I know my mother had a favorite poem in there, that coffee pot. Like you're so funny. And I think you said, Patrick said, not everybody can do that. How do you do that? And you're like, what?
Life is so absurd, isn't it? Life is so surreal. You keep saying things, well, you couldn't even write about that, what that person just did in the grocery store. I do find things really tickle my fancy. And I love being able to put humor into something that is usually very dour. Like I would say to people when I was talking about both the memoir Through the Garden and after that although many of the poems touch on deep loss and sadness, there is a lightness to them too. And sometimes one hopes that they'll even provoke a smile or a chuckle. So I just can't help that being there. I think it's so part of being human. I once heard Mary Walsh, of whom I'm a great fan, say that when she writes comedy, the only comedy that works is when she digs down hard or digs down to a hard truth. And I think we can say the same thing about poetry and prose. We're digging down to a hard truth. And sometimes the hard truth makes you laugh.
And the idea of prose too. So I know we talked about, okay, you did teach at UVic. We met during a workshop at Wintergreen. I was lucky enough to attend with you twice. Oh my gosh. And you have this way, like you really encouraged me to look at prose as poetry when I had somehow, it was just in like a no man's land for me. It's like, oh, I must be a precise poet or I must be a literary person. And prose is so freeing. The line breaks are freeing. The depth you can, like the limited depth is so freeing. I think I want to thank you for encouraging that. And I'm wondering how you find writing prose. Is it more joyful?
It's just different. I think everything that you said is true. You're allowed to be a bit more discursive in a prose poem than you are in a poem. And you're allowed to kind of drag more stuff in a way. And I think they're well suited to being philosophical, to the essay form, to a different kind of narrative than you get in a narrative poem. So I find the prose poem form fascinating because, it's an oxymoron, right? The prose poem, like it's a giraffe with a zebra's head. And so there's a challenge. How do you keep it lyrical, even though you're writing in sentences? How do you make it look like it is a well-formed thing, and there shouldn't be one extra sentence or one extra paragraph, that it on its own is saying everything it needs to say. So I love that kind of constriction that the form imposes on a possibility of longer prose pieces. So they're a delight for me to keep exploring it. They're not well defined. No one completely understands them. And that's kind of intriguing too. Poetry's been around a long, long time. Free verse has been around, almost 200 years now. But prose poems became popular in the middle part of the 20th century, even though Baudelaire was writing them, in the 1800s in France. They didn't become popular as a North American form until much, much later. So they feel kind of new. There's no dust on them yet. So you're kind of defining them as you're writing them too. And that makes it fun.
So this book is coming out in next year, 2027.
Right now it's called The Book of Everything and Nothing.
Okay, we'll see if that's what it remains. Would you read something? It could be a new poem, an old poem, one of each. I would just be so honored if you would share some of your writing today.
It would be my great delight. Poetry is meant to be read out loud, right? It's an oral form. Even when it's a prose poem, I think it's meant to be read out loud. And when I'm writing prose poems, I read every single sentence out loud as I'm writing it. And when I'm revising it, I do it again. And I work on the rhythm of the sentences to make sure that they sound the way they should. So I'm not going to read prose poems. After having said all that, I'm going to read 2 delineated poems. I'll read one about Patrick being in the garden, and then I'll read a brand new poem. Watercolor. Did you see the magnolia light its pink fires inside the white, white blossoms? You were gone before that first flush. I don't know where you are now. If you have a view of the garden like the one we climbed the roof to see. Bird's eye, bat's eye of passing cloud. The pond to me looks sad. Water lilies that opened in your poems flower once and then give up. My fault, perhaps. I don't know if I'm to push into their soil a fertilizer tab the size of a Tums that settles in digestion. I seem to remember you did that when you waded in bare-chested in your briefs, deleted expired buds and leaves, your legs white as magnolia blossoms and cold. We had an eternity together. Today, it feels like just a day, dawn seeping into dusk the minute the painter slides his wet brush across the homemade paper. No pencil lines to separate and make a difference. Just water running into water and becoming something else. I apologize for my voice. I'm just getting over a cold, so I'm a bit creaky.
Oh, I thought you'd taken up smoking.
There's an idea. Oh, and this is a new poem that I wrote after my new partner moved in. All the tricks. Oh, by the way, I should say, when Tom arrived, he arrived with a 14-year-old Norwegian elk hound who is no longer with us. All the tricks. My husband welcomes my new man. He puts his arm around him, says, "Here's my favorite frying pan, the shovel I used to bury the cat, my Irish pipe she forgot with all the other stuff to give away." My husband welcomes my new man. He puts his arm around him, says this and that about my ways, what makes me weep, what satiates, what I once believed in. I try to be quiet. I sit with the dog and watch them. There's never been a dog in this house before. My husband doesn't mention it, and the dog acts as if there's nothing strange. Maybe he's used to ghosts. Maybe dogs see them all the time. My husband taking him for walks up the hills, deep into the trees, when my new man and I lie in bed together. That could be why the dog's so sleepy in the mornings and why he's turned into a beggar. My husband's shown him all the tricks. At the table, the dog licks my fingers with his big tongue when he wants a treat.
I love that poem. And a Norwegian elk hound is a very big dog.
Not really. You're thinking of the Irish wolfhound.
Oh, okay.
The Norwegian elk hound's about the size of a husky, but a little bit more sturdy. And he was lovely. His name was Rocco. And it was a delight to have him around even for a short time.
And does Rocco live in the garden now?
No, he's still in a jar in Tom's studio.
I know that there's a cat or two in your garden, I think.
Yeah, 2 cats in the yard.
2 cats. One thing I like to ask everybody are about books. And I know you are a reader of readers, and oh my goodness, you've taught so many fantastic authors. Can you share a few books that have meant something to you or that you'd like to recommend to people?
What I found I'm doing lately, I'm still reading new books, but I'm also going through my library and saying, am I going to read this book again, or should I give it away because I need more space? But that's brought me back to some books that have been companions and looking at them again and rediscovering things. I just, last couple of days, have been looking at Pessoa, his book of Disquiet. It's just so brilliant. It was formed out of around 400 pages being found in a trunk. And he had a number of heteronyms, a number of aliases that he wrote under. And so this book is fragments written from various of his heteronyms. It's a fascinating book. I'd highly recommend it to any writer and reader. He writes in Portuguese, so it was translated. And then the other old book I dipped into the other day was John Berger's The Wedding. Berger is one of my go-back-to writers. He's hard to define. He's an art critic, a poet, a philosopher, a novelist, all of these things combined into one. And many of his books, I think, are unclassifiable. I always look again at Charles Wright, any of his poetry books. He's a Southern poet from Virginia. He brings in much holiness, or the wish for holiness, into his work. A new book, which just arrived in the mail the other day, is, where did I put it? Liz Phillips' new book of poetry, The Time of the Great Singing, published by Freehand in Calgary. And I sat down and read it yesterday, and it's just exquisite. I think it's Elizabeth writing at her best, and she's such a damn fine writer. I'm reading a novel now by George Saunders, Lincoln in the Bardo. It came out a few years ago, and I got through about 20 pages and for some reason stopped. But now I'm reading it in its entirety, and it's a little piece of magic. He also wrote a wonderful book about the short story. The title's gone out of my head right now, but if you Google George Saunders, Saunders, you'll see this book about his examination of the short story. He includes short stories by the famous Russians, and then he analyzes them, but in a very warm, humorous, companionable, non-academic way. If you're interested in writing fiction, I highly, highly recommend it.
That's great. Yeah, that book has something with like pond in the title.
Yeah, swimming.
I thought Lincoln in the Bardo, once you commit to it, like I had a hard time getting into it too, but once you open that magical door, you're just in this world. It's incredible.
And it's so heartbreaking. It's Lincoln's son died right when the Civil War was in its initial moments. And it's about the son not moving on, being in Bardo, which is that liminal state before you move on to another body or move off the wheel of life. And Lincoln goes to the cemetery to see this boy, and he's heartbroken. And that death gets reflected in the deaths of all of the American soldiers who are perishing in the war. It's an amazing tour de force.
I agree. I just want to say thank you so much for agreeing to be on the podcast. I know my mom is smiling, and I am loving the words. Looking forward to your new books. Maybe one day we meet again and I, listen to your wise words in person.
Well, I want to say I hope we see each other at Wintergreen again. And I remember that prose piece you wrote, and it was wonderful. It was a real leap forward for you. It was just a delight to hear it. And I hope you're continuing on with those.
Well, I am now.
Good. Excellent.
Yeah, thank you so much, and happy National Poetry Month.
Thank you. And thanks for doing this, Carrie. Your questions are so good, and you do this so professionally. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. If you like the show, please tell your friends.